Hello everyone, this is Tahrin Afrin from HAP 671. I'm presenting my LM9 Teach 1 Entity Relationship Diagram. Introduction. The Entity Relationship Diagram, also known as ERD, is a popular graphical depiction of entities, their attributes, and the relationship between them in the field of database design. ERD is a crucial tool for planning and describing complex databases. The key concepts and components of the ERD, as well as its advantages and potential applications for modeling complex data structures, will be covered in this presentation. What is an entity relationship diagram? An entity relationship diagram is a graphical representation of entities, their attributes, and relationship between them. ERD is a tool used in database design to model the data structure of a system. It is a visual representation of the data entities, their relationships, and the attributes of each entity. ERD represents a database conceptually as viewed by the end user. The ERD provides a clear and concise view of data structure and their relationships between entities. There are three components of an entity relationship diagram, which are entities, attributes, and relationships. Entities, also known as entity sets, is a real-world object or concept that has its own unique identity. It can be a physical object such as a car or a person, or an object concept such as an event or customer account. Each entity has a set of attributes that describes the characteristics. For example, a customer identity might have attributes such as customer ID, name, address, and phone number. An ER diagram In ER diagram, an entity is represented as triangle. There are two types of entities, strong entities and weak entities. These are entities that have their own unique attributes that can exist independently. Strong entities do not depend on any other entities. Examples of strong entities are a person, a product, or an order. Weak entities. These are entities that do not have their own unique attributes and can only exist in relation to a strong entity. They rely on existence of a strong entity to be created. Examples of weak entities are an order line item or dependent in an employee database. Attributes. Attributes are characteristics of an entity. They describe the property of an entity such as name, address, and phone number. In an ER diagram, an attribute is represented as an oval or ellipse inside an entity rectangle. There are 6 types of attributes: simple attributes, composite attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, derived attribute, and null attribute. Simple attribute. Simple attribute is an attribute that cannot be divided into smaller parts. For example, in an employee database, the attribute employee name is a simple attribute. A composite attribute is an attribute that can be divided into smaller parts. For example, an employee database, the attribute address can be divided into smaller parts such as city, street, state, zip code. Single valued attribute is an attribute that can have only one value for a particular entity. For example, in a customer database, the attribute email address can only have one value for a particular customer. A multi-valued attribute is an attribute that can have multiple values for a particular entry. For example, in a customer database, the attribute phone number can have multiple values for a particular customer. Derived attribute is an attribute that is calculated based on other attributes. For example, in an employee database, the attribute age can be derived from the attribute date of birth. Null attribute. Null attribute is an attribute that has no value or has not been assigned a value for a particular instance for an entity. Example, middle name. Relationship. A relationship is a connection or association between two or more entities. In an ER diagram, an relationship is represented as a diamond shape with connecting lines to related entities. There are two types of relationship: strong relationship and weak relationship. A strong relationship exists when the existence of one entity depends on the existence of another entity. In other words, the two entities are closely connected and one entity cannot exist without the other. Weak relationship. A weak relationship exists when the existence of an entity does not depend on existence of another entity. Entity keys. There are two types of entity keys: primary key and foreign key. Primary key is a unique identifier for an entity instance within an entity set. It must be unique for each entity instance and cannot be null. The primary key is often represented as underlined in an ERD diagram. Foreign key. It's an attribute in one entity set that refers to primary key of another entity set. It is used to establish relationship between entities. A foreign key can have null values and is represented as a dotted underline in an ERD. ERD connectivity and cardinality. Connectivity describes the relationship classification. Cardinality is an important aspect of entity relationship diagram that define the number of instances of one entity that is associated with the number of instances with another entity. In other words, cardinality specifies the relationship between entities by determining how many entities of each type can be related to one another. Types of cardinality. There are three types of cardinality in ERD, which are one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. One-to-one cardinality. In one-to-one relationship, each instance of one entity is associated with only one instance of another entity and vice versa. This relationship is represented by a straight line between the two entities in the ERD. For example, in a university database, one student can only have one student ID, and one student ID can belong to only one student. One-to-many cardinality. In one-to-many relationship, one instance of one entity can be associated with multiple instances of another entity, but each instance of second entity is associated with the one instance of the first entity only. This relationship is represented by an arrow pointed from the first entity to the second entity in the ERD. For example, In a university database, one department can have many courses, but each course can belong to only one department. Many to many. Many to many cardinality. In a many to many relationship, each instance of one entity can be associated with multiple instances of another entity and vice versa. The relationship is presented by a diamond shape in the ERD. For example, in a university database, one student can take many courses and each courses can be taken by many students. Crow's foot symbols are also used in the entity relationship diagram to describe cardinality. Relationship degree. There are three relationship degrees: unary relationship, binary relationship, and ternary relationship. A unary relationship involves a single entity type. The association is maintained within a single entity and also called recursive. A common example of a ternary relationship is a manager relationship in an employee database. A binary relationship involves two entity types. For example, a professor entity might have a relationship with class entity, where each professor can teach multiple classes. Ternary relationship. A ternary relationship involves three entity types. For example, a patient entity might have a relationship with a doctor entity and a prescription entity, where each patient can have multiple prescriptions from different doctors. Relationship participation, mandatory participation and optional participation. Also known as total participation, mandatory participation means that every entity in one entity set must participate in relationship with an entity in another entity set. For example, in a database for a university, every student must be enrolled in at least one course and every course must have at least one student enrolled. Optional participation, also known as partial participation. Optional participation means that some entities in one entity set may not be participate in a relationship with an entity in another entity set. For example, in a database for a library, a book can be borrowed by 0 or more members, and a member can borrow 0 or more books. Process of developing an ER diagram. Create details narrative of organization's description of operations. Identify business rules based on description of operations. Identify main entities and relationships from business rules. Develop initial entity relationship diagram. Identify attributes and primary keys that adequately describes entities. Revise and review entity relationship diagram. Advantages of using an entity relationship diagram. There are several advantages of using an entity relationship diagram for database design. Clear representation of data, improved communication, improved data quality, easy maintenance, and reduced development time.